for Reimaging Information Literacy with Threshold Concepts. Parker O'Mara is a systems librarian at SUNY Plattsburgh, and he will be talking to us about the recently completed reimaging of his information literacy instruction at SUNY Plattsburgh, discussing his one credit class. So I will just turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Parker O'Mara, and I'm the systems librarian at SUNY Plattsburgh. But before I start, I just want to kind of give a shout out to Thomas and Trudy for their keynote. One of the persistent, I'm going to talk about our class that we teach, and one of the persistent complaints, and this is among the library faculty, is that among students there's a lack of interest and there is a perception of irrelevance. They don't see, how they're going to use this stuff. I know that's probably a complaint across the board, but I think they had that one graphic of using collaboration and kind of making more of a holistic approach how we do what we do. I think that is so important. I thought that was so nice to hear. But anyhow, back to my lecture here. Now, I chose to leave the lights on because there isn't a way to turn off the front and leave the back on. I don't have a real text-heavy presentation because I think it's too hard to listen and read. So I can turn them off if people find that they want to see the slides more than me. So, whichever. Let me know what you want. But anyhow, reimagining information literacy with threshold concepts is the topic. But what I'm really going to do is just tell you the story of how we redesigned and revamped our information literacy class at SUNY Plattsburgh. And to start, I'll just give a little bit about Plattsburgh and our class. SUNY Plattsburgh, about 6,000 FTEs. It's a 4-year comprehensive liberal arts college. It's part of the State University of New York. And since 1979, as part of the general education requirements for graduation, students have had to take a 1-credit-hour information literacy course that's taught by the library faculty. There's an equivalency test that if they pass it, they get the credit and they don't have to sit through the class, but otherwise they have to take this class so that they can graduate. And in the 35 years that this course has existed, it has gone through several iterations. Periodically, the librarians will give the course an overhaul. Of course, one of the reasons is content, because obviously over the last 35 years, how we access information has changed, and we want to, of course, reflect that. But these iterations have been different in the amount of organization, how standardized the curriculum is, and also different pedagogical models we've tried to work with. I started at Plattsburgh about 2.5 years ago. When I started, I was given a very thin description of what the course, the concepts that the course had to cover, with no instruction as to the order I covered them or into how much detail any single topic was covered or how I evaluated it or what kind of assignments I gave or what kind of teaching model I used or anything like that. And I'm told in the past, there were, when a new librarian started, they put a 3-ring binder down on their desk and said, here's your course, here's what you teach, here's the order, here's how long, here's your assessments. It was very, very standardized. So also, not too long after I had started, we got a new dean, and she initiated this one of these periodic overhauls of the class. And the goal was actually, there were 3 goals. The first was, the purpose was threefold. The first was that it's periodic. It's something we do periodically to just freshen up the class and make sure it continues to be relevant. The second reason was, at the same time, the general education requirements at Plattsburgh were being evaluated. And there was some talk, because the course does have some detractors on campus, and they were saying that the skills that are covered in this class will now be covered in other general education courses. Therefore, we won't need this class any longer. And there are people who would like that to be the case. They don't like the class. They don't think it has relevance, so they want to get rid of it. And as a library faculty, we didn't want that to happen. So we thought what a good way to kind of make the existence of the class more defendable was to revamp it and make sure it's kind of reflecting latest pedagogical thinking in the fields. And then the third reason was one of workload. This course has perennially been a huge workload issue for the librarians. Because all full-time librarians on the faculty teach 2 sections per semester of 25 students. And that's in addition to our just normal duties as librarians. You know, I'm in systems, so I take care of all the system stuff in addition to teaching. Our reference librarians, they do regular reference hours, they do the the one-shot instruction, as well as myriad other projects and just all kinds of other duties. So it has always been a huge workload issue. And one of the goals of this revamp was to make something that was a little bit more modular. So for instance, a couple librarians could sit down and create a module that teaches a certain concept, share it with the rest of the librarians, and you could kind of plug it into your course. So it wasn't a situation where everybody had to reinvent their own wheel for this class. So that was kind of the thinking behind this, this revamp. So what we did was we formed a committee among our library faculty to just go out and create this new course. And then we were going to come back to the whole faculty and hopefully get it approved. And how we came to decide that the threshold concept was the model we wanted to follow was one of the faculty members on this committee had been out doing some research on it. In fact, she had been very involved in information literacy. She'd been around, I think, 30 years, pushing 30 years, she's been a librarian, so she's always been very involved with information literacy. And she was doing some research on this concept. And after we hashed it out a bit and kind of wrapped our head around just what exactly the threshold concepts were all about, we decided that it probably would serve that desire to make something that's modular. You know, if we could have librarians creating modules for a particular threshold concept that might be able to be plugged into a curriculum. So that was pretty much it. That's why we decided to go with the threshold concepts. And now I'm no expert on the threshold concepts. I had never heard of it, to be honest, before we started working on this, and this is about 2 years ago now. So I'll just give a brief overview of the threshold concepts as I understand them. And this is a quote from Jan Mayer and Ray Land, who are the 2 researchers who kind of created this concept. And what they said, and this is in 2003, a threshold concept can be considered as akin to a portal, opening up a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting or viewing something without which the learner cannot progress. And that's the last long quote, by the way. As I said, I don't want to do a text-heavy presentation. So just some bullets about the threshold concept. Ray Land and Jan Mayer were working as a part of a bigger project studying undergraduate education in the UK. And they were focusing on economics education. And what they found within the discipline of economics was that there was a certain set of core principles that most economics professors believed to be thresholds that you needed to cross to go from being a non-economist to being an economist. From going to somebody who doesn't think like an economist to somebody who does think like an economist. And they differentiated these threshold concepts from just core concepts in that using physics as an example. The center of gravity is a core concept. It's a very important concept you need to grasp to work in the realm of physics. But that gravity would be the threshold concept. That you need to know what gravity is before you can start thinking about center of gravity. And as they did a little more research, they found that most disciplines had this kind of phenomena, that there were this sort of unstated, often unstated set of concepts that professionals in the field had. They were more of ways of thinking. They weren't math learners. They were ways of thinking about something that they felt their students needed to grasp so that they could, get to the inside rather than being on the outside of whatever the discipline was that they were talking about. As they mentioned during the keynote, that oftentimes, because these are such bedrock threshold concepts, the professors didn't directly address them. They had so long ago crossed this threshold on their own that they kind of missed it. You know, it was like too obvious to teach. And they found that if you couldn't really address these directly, that your students are more easily able to go from the outside to the inside. They identified 5 key criteria, and Trudy did go through this list, but I'll just go through it again. That there are 3 key criteria to be a threshold concept. And the first one is that it's transformative. That it is it represents a paradigm shift from before you know it to when you do know it. And I just use gravity as an example, using this physics example. That if you don't understand gravity, you really are on the outside of physics thought. Number 2, it's integrative. Once you have the threshold concept, you can build, it ties together otherwise what are seemingly disparate ideas. So for example, once you understand gravity, you can understand why the tides happen, why astronauts float around space station, and why an apple fell on Newton's head. You can see that these are really the same concept, and you can see the relationships between them, whereas before they just seemed like disparate phenomena that you wouldn't necessarily see a connection between them. Irreversible. Once you get it, you can't go to ungetting. And now this is not a threshold concept, but I think it demonstrates it nicely. Now, some of you may know, or some of you may not know, that there's an arrow in the logo for FedEx. And now, do you see it? Will you ever not see that arrow? That's kind of the idea. Once you get it, you can't go to ungetting it. Troublesome. And this, I think, is interesting because it seems like it's so obvious that as teachers, we should think about what is troublesome to our students when we're designing curriculum. It seems like of course we should be doing this. But there's this other field of study talking about troublesome knowledge, and they found that with these threshold concepts, they were just concepts that students tended to have trouble grasping. Because again, these weren't core concepts in that, E equals MC squared, where you got to memorize it. These are more ways of thinking that are more difficult to grasp, and they're more subtle. They really represented a change in perspective on something rather than an acquisition of a bunch of definitions. So they're very troublesome in that regard. And then lastly, they're bounded. They found that these threshold concepts are kind of bounded by the discipline within which they exist. And now for our discipline, they're bounded within the discipline that is the meta-literacy, that is information literacy, but obviously they're applicable to any discipline that you work in. That's kind of the deal with being a librarian, but they're bounded within information literacy. So what are our threshold concepts? And this slide is pretty much blank because I couldn't really describe it well, but this piece, determining what exactly are our threshold concepts, really took a lot of time. It took a lot of debate. It took a lot of wrapping our heads around, first of all, the threshold concept. Well, what are they talking about? We had to learn what they were talking about when they're talking about threshold concepts. And after we kind of got it, and I think it kind of represents that same irony I just mentioned, and Trudy mentioned, is that some of these concepts are so bedrock to our practice that we don't see them, so we had to step back and really think about, well, what is it exactly that takes somebody from not thinking, and we're not trying to make little librarians, but trying to make somebody who is an information literate citizen. That's a student and citizen. That's our goal. What are those concepts that takes a person from not being that to being that? And it took a lot of debate. It took a lot of bouncing it off of each other, and a lot of misunderstanding because we each really had kind of different conceptions of what we were talking about. We were talking about the same thing. We kind of expressed it differently and focused on different areas of information literacy. I was happy to see that one of the recommended readings, that Threshold Concepts in Information Literacy that they put out, I hope people have had an opportunity to take a look at it. For that, I have a copy of it right here. It's by Lori Townsend, Corey Brunetti, and Amy Hofer, and it really was a foundational document for us. We used it a lot to develop our concepts. In their document, they defined 5 threshold concepts, and we stuck with the model of have 5 threshold concepts. We took 3 of theirs, and then we kind of adapted 2 for our own purposes. So the threshold concepts we've come up with are topic analysis, pursuit of information, format as process, authority constructed and contextual, and information as a commodity. And I think the middle 3 we lifted directly. So I know authority and format are both, they're part of the ACRL, so I'm assuming.
It's actually the last 3.
It's the last 3? Okay. Last 3. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll just go through each one, talk a little bit about how we define the threshold, the objectives we set, and what's the outcome we want our students to have, once they get this concept. So the first one is topic analysis. And this one is, in a nutshell, it deals with research strategies and kind of that beginning piece of research where you need to define the parameters of whatever your assignment is. You need to understand your assignment and understand, what is the professor looking for? Are they looking for an argumentative paper? Are they just looking for an opinion piece? What are they looking for in this paper? And I found, and I know my colleagues found this also, that oftentimes students, the topic of their research is driven by their first Google search. And they don't think about what they want to do before they start doing it. They will take some broad keywords and do a search, and they will say, okay, that's going to be my topic. And then sometimes they have something that's way too broad, or sometimes they get to the end and they find that they're just lost in the weeds with it. So we, as a committee, felt that analyzing the topic and really understanding just what exactly it is that you're supposed to be doing is the first threshold that we think our students needed to cross. And our outcome was that students will be able to refine and articulate an information need and develop a research strategy to effectively meet it. And then the objectives are students will be able to examine a topic and define its parameters, and students will be able to create a research plan in order to find the information that they've decided, they've determined they needed. So that's topic analysis. Pursuit of information. I've taught this course as a skills course. It's a 1 credit hour class. It meets for 10 weeks out of the semester. It's not a full semester class. And it was LIB 105, and the new class is LIB 200, but that's really just a psychological thing because there's no prerequisites to take the course, and it's not a requirement for any other course. So we really don't control who signs up for it. So even though it was intended for freshmen coming in, only about 40% of our students are actually freshmen. And every semester I have 2 or 3 second semester seniors who just need that class to get out of school. So, but anyhow, my thought was that it was still a skills course because so many students come into college with varying degrees of information literacy skills, and then they're faced with all kinds of new resources once they get here. They don't know what databases we have. They may have never seen a LibGuide, and they're just not familiar with how to use them. They may have never used ILL before. They just don't know what collections are even available on the web. And they're not accustomed to the kind of thinking and the kind of work that's required in college. So, pursuit of information, as I interpret it, is that portion of information literacy where you need to kind of understand what tools are available. You need to know where to go when you need a certain kind, like if you need a scholarly journal article, don't go to our OPAC. If you are looking for a book, don't go Google it. Search our OPAC. So this one, to my thinking, is that step where that threshold where you understand the tools that are available, you understand how to use those tools, and then you understand when to use those tools. And the outcomes are just students will recognize the value and diversity of search tools and their distinct purposes. And we had 3 outcomes for this, objectives rather. Students will be able to distinguish the role and purpose of discovery search tools. Students will be able to select appropriate search tools, and students will be able to construct well-formed search strategies. Because again, my thinking is that if you just teach a course on theory, information theory, the information cycle, with no information on how to actually go out and find information, you've missed the mark. So I think that's what this threshold really talks about, is understanding what we have, understanding how to pick the right tool, and then understand how to use that tool and get good information from that tool. Format as process. One of this is what makes this troublesome. I found it, and this was sort of the collective thinking among this committee that I was on, was that this idea that information is flat. That when a student does a search, they're all web pages, or they're all just hits on a search list. And it's troublesome, I think, because they're not incorrect. I mean, when you're looking at electronic resources, I mean, they are all web pages. I mean, they're all electronic documents you view through a browser that have been transmitted via HTTP protocol. So they're not incorrect in saying, yeah, these are all web pages. But what this threshold speaks to is talking about the process that went into creating that resource. So that when you get a list, and this is kind of being a further, for our school, further complicated, in that we're implementing EBSCO Discovery Service in the fall. So it's another place where you can do a search and you just get a list of stuff, Just like when you Google it. I know the intention is to make it more like Google so it's easier to use, but I think in a real way it makes it more complicated, because whereas when you were searching our OPAC, you're getting books. I mean, they may be e-books, but they're books. But now when you do EDS, you're getting books, you're getting scholarly articles. You don't know what you're getting. You might be getting a GovDoc. It might be e-book. You just don't know. Without training, you don't know what you're getting. So I think it may make it more troublesome until students know how to find out what they're looking at. So for format as process, the outcome is students will recognize the information landscape and be able to distinguish different types of formats and how they're constructed. So, and I know this does not represent new thinking, and this is really not a product of the digital age, because obviously a book has always been different than a magazine, which has always been different than a scholarly article, which has always been different than a magazine or a newspaper. But I do think it becomes more ambiguous when you do one search and you get all these things at once. They're not separated by physical distance, they're not separated by physical space or shape. They're just hits on a list. And obviously there's so many more, blogs. Let's talk about blogs. What goes into making a blog? And then we'll talk about authority. What's the difference between a blog by, just anybody, or a professor blogging about a topic within their discipline, or a journalist blogging within the publication for which they write. What is the process that goes into making these items? And again, I don't think it's a new concept. It's just, I think the difficulty, the troublesomeness of it is exacerbated by the fact that so much is just electronic information. And our objectives are just that students will be able to distinguish the variety of information formats. Students will analyze the resource creation process, and students will apply this knowledge of formats when selecting search tools. So basically, first step, you got to know what you're looking at. If you do an EDS search, you need to know, am I looking at a book? Am I looking at a scholarly article? If I do a Google search, am I looking at a newspaper article? Am I looking at a blog post? Am I looking at a web page? And then, first of all, after you understand what you're looking at, then understand a little bit about that kind of resource to understand what goes into making it. You know, where does it fall in the information cycle? And then take this knowledge of formats and apply it to using search tools more effectively. Excuse me. Authority constructed and contextual. I think a good analogy to authority constructed contextual involves back in the early 60s, there was a Supreme Court case. There was a movie theater owner, I think it was in Ohio, who showed a film that the local authorities found offensive and obscene and arrested him. And he said, no, that was not pornography, that was art. And so the case went up to the Supreme Court, and one of the justices, in his opinion, wrote, and I'll paraphrase, he said, I can't sit here and define what exactly is pornography, but I know it when I see it. And I think as information professionals, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I can't tell you exactly what makes something authoritative, but I know it when I see it. So this threshold talks about that, talks about authority, what makes authority. Now, again, I've always used the CRAP test. I like the CRAP test because I think it gives a nice visual for students to go down and does it meet these criteria, doesn't it meet these criteria? But I try to impress upon them that it's not like a math formula, that if it gets a certain number of points, you use it, and if it doesn't make that threshold, you don't use it. And I use like martinlutherking.org to demonstrate it, because they all come in and say, well, I know you don't use .coms and .orgs are okay. And I was like, okay, well, let's look at this one. And it, not always true. And that doesn't even address the whole Wikipedia thing. I know that's a whole nother kettle of fish when you're talking about authority. But rather than talking about it is or it isn't authoritative, I think we, on the inside, information professionals, we do think about, well, how is it constructed and what's the context? For somebody who's trying to set up a network, a home network in their house, well, going to Wikipedia or going to blogs is probably a perfectly reasonable way to go to find answers to those kinds of questions. But if you're a computer science major writing some sort of paper about networking, probably not. That's the gist of it. With the outcome being students will be able to determine the appropriate authority necessary to address an information need and how that authority is constructed. In my class, and up till, we haven't actually used this yet, just so we're clear on that. This class will be rolled out in the fall. So the rest of my summer, I'm also moving online, so I have to redesign my course totally to make it threshold concepts and online. But in the past course, I always did the annotated bibliography. And I did interviews with students. And I had them pull a couple of the resources they put in their bibliography, and I grill them. I was like, well, why do you trust that? Why do you believe with that person or why that organization, why do you believe what they're saying is correct and is unbiased? And some of them, they point out some good things, and after a while, they kind of crack under the pressure. Like, I don't know, man, I don't know. It was third in the hit list. What do you want? And but I just think it's that fundamental. I think it's probably the most important skill that we can teach as librarians. Or information professionals. In fact, I've heard information literacy defined simply as what you know and how you know it. And it's just all about authority. It's just being able to state something and then state how you know that to be true or correct or accurate or whatever. And so our outcomes, students will be able to recognize the significance and relativity of authority. Students will be able to judge what confers authority to different types of information resources, and students will be able to choose the appropriate level of authority along with other evaluative criteria. So again, you know, if you're setting up this network in your house, you probably don't need a scholarly article from a computer science journal. Okay, but if you're a computer science major working on a capstone project, you probably, I mean, I shouldn't say probably, but you may most often not want to be going to a blog post about networking or some sort of a message board. And that's the gist of authority, constructed and contextual. And then lastly, information as a commodity. And this one, to be honest, was the one we had the most difficulty kind of fleshing out, because we all had this idea of what this threshold was, but kind of determining what was, I don't know, lack of a better word, scope of how we wanted to express it, I guess. But basically, this is the threshold that talks about intellectual property, plagiarism, academic honesty, copyright, fair use. But this is one credit our course. You know, we're not lawyers. We're not teaching law students, so we're not really delving too deeply into copyright. You know, we're not. It's not like the course isn't part of their orientation where it's like, well, don't steal papers, don't turn in somebody else's work as your own, yada yada. So it took a lot of time to really flesh out what exactly we wanted to express as the threshold, dealing with information as a commodity. And fundamentally, we wanted to express that information has value. You know, that information is usually, well, it is owned by somebody or by some organization, unless they've said, you know, I don't take any kind of ownership rights to this. And that's fundamentally it. Excuse me. So the outcome is that students will be able to explain and apply appropriate ethical and legal use of information. Rather than talking about, you know, making the outcome something to do with copyright or with fair use or with plagiarism, really we're talking about the more fundamental bedrock idea that students need to be aware that information is owned by somebody, usually. And if it's not owned, there's ways for you to find out whether it is or isn't owned and what kind of uses you can actually apply to that information. And that's it, you know, and that's it in a nutshell. So information as a commodity, the objectives are that students will utilize citations in order to use information ethically, and students will recognize the importance of copyright to the access, use, and creation of information in order to understand its legal. So we did kind of, you know, when it came to the objectives, you know, these are the things that we'll assess. It would kind of go back down into, you know, this is copyright, this is fair use, you're in the fair use bubble. Once you leave school, you won't be in the fair use bubble. If you're printing t-shirts in your dorms, you're not protected by the fair use bubble. And this is a little bit about how you cite things, and this is more importantly why you cite things. And so that was it. We came up with our 5 threshold concepts. We kind of finalized the language that we wanted to, and we had, like I said, much debate amongst ourselves as to just what exactly were the concepts that we wanted to present. And then we presented it to the faculty as a whole, and they accepted it as sort of the skeleton on which they were going to flesh out a more complete course. And this is where I stepped out of the process, because I'm on technical services side. This went to our other unit, which is our instructional unit, and they did more like this modular approach where 2 librarians took one threshold concept, and they created some classes rather, that would be based on that concept, you know, and then presented it back to the group where we can all And then in closing, just a few observations about the process. One of the books, I'm drawing a blank on it, it's this one, Jan Mayer and Grayland, Threshold Concepts and Troublesome Knowledge, Linkages to Ways of Thinking. There was a chapter in that book titled something to the effect of, are the threshold concepts really just old wine in new bottles? And the question was, does this really represent a new pedagogical model? Is this really anything new at all? Is it just kind of a reshuffling of what we're already doing? And I mention it because this was one of the thoughts that I had, that, you know, we talk about this threshold concept, but then we just keep going back to the skills that represent that threshold concept. And I'm wondering, well, are we really doing anything different? You know, it's like, really, are we just saying, okay, you know, this used to be my citation, and now it's information as a commodity? Am I really just reshuffling my cards and calling it a new deck? And I don't know, and I don't have an answer to that. This is just my thought that I was having about it. But what I do think is nice about it, and this came up during the keynote. A public librarian asked about, you know, how do you deal with people with different levels of skill coming into your library? And you know, even though we do have more of a homogeneous group, you know, being undergraduate students, it is really quite diverse in that we have a large number of international students, and you know, many of our international students, besides having a language barrier, really have not been introduced to these concepts at all. You know, they don't have library programs in their high schools where they're coming from, so this stuff is really foreign to them. And we have a fair number of non-traditional students who you know, were in high school 20 years ago, and now they're coming back to college, so this stuff is all new. And this was a debate that we had among all the debates, that should we be focusing on our course and the parameters of our course, which are, it's 1 credit, it's you know, mostly freshmen, but not all freshmen, it's only 10 weeks, or should we go for more universal? And I think we went for the broader picture of more universal threshold concepts. And what I think is, since you know, you could cater these 5 threshold concepts to kindergartners, I believe. You know, you can talk about format as process to a small child, or also to a senior citizen who doesn't have, you know, strong computer skills. And I do think that is a strength of the threshold concept. And another strength of it is that, like I said, it really forced us as librarians to kind of reflect back, you know, like this metacognition, thinking about our thinking. It's like, what do I really think is important? You know, besides, here's how you use Google, you know, because I think that's important. And here's how you use our databases. You know, here's how you order a book through ILL. And I think those skills are important too, but, you know, to really look deeper and like, what is the concept behind it? Like, philosophically, what are we thinking about this? So I think it remains to be seen, I guess, how this new threshold or this new format goes. I think, you know, in the next 3 or 4 semesters we'll have a clearer picture of how it really translates into the real world. But I do think it ties nicely to what they're talking about during the keynote, because I do think it's more of a holistic approach to looking at information and literacy. Because as I said in the beginning, one of the just perennial complaints with this course has been this perception of irrelevance. They didn't see, you know, how they were going to use it, and oftentimes they think they have the skills already. I mean, now that's another issue. Yeah, and I had another point about just reflecting on it, and I don't remember it, so I couldn't have done that for you. But anyhow. That was 37 minutes, and I think the block is like 50 minutes before lunch, so I wanted to leave some time to open it up for questions and discussion. So I'd love to hear what people think about this and see what they're doing in their libraries. Yeah?
So how exactly are you planning on delivering this class? Is it all face-to-face instruction? Is it online? Is it a hybrid of both? You have tutorials they watch and then discussing in class?
Well, we actually all three. There's a face-to-face option where you're going to meet. You'll have 10 sessions in a classroom. There's a hybrid approach where you'll meet, I think, 8 times, and then you have 2 classes that you can design online, and then you have a completely online option. Up till now, I've been teaching in the classroom, and with this semester in the fall, I'm going to take it online. That's kind of like the physical parameters, but as far as how it's taught, it really, I think, you know, I'm sad to say, but a lot of times it was just like a traditional class, you know. I tried to make mine where I would stand and talk for no more than 20 minutes and then have my students doing an activity because it was a computer lab, so everybody had a computer. My thinking being that it's, if they did the work, you know, on whatever the skill was, you know, whether it's citing or, you know, using a citation generator, whatever that, if I'm there, when they get stuck and they raise their hand, I can go over them and answer it right at the time. Because I'm thinking if they're in their dorm working at 10 o'clock at night, once they get stuck, they're stuck. There's really no way to get unstuck. But if they're in the class, they can, you know, raise their hand and just get them back on track. So, yeah, before I came on board, there was another group of librarians who were looking at alternatives to this class. That in case it was kind of nixed by Gen Ed, or if there really was a better way to do it. They were looking at some different ideas, and one of them was, you know, this online tutorial where, you know, you have to take the tutorial and then at the end of it you get credit, like so many things are nowadays. And they decided to stick with the kind of more traditional class, thinking that, you know, it's more that the personal touch, you know, having a live person to come over and talk to you, you know, about whatever you're working on. Yeah.
Thinking about format as process, the idea of trying to figure out what is the format and the discovery service, you know, makes it harder. You know, when we would talk about this in my library, my much younger colleague, you know, would say to me, "What does it matter? Why do we care?" You know, it seems like maybe we're moving away from being all anxious about like, but is it a book? Is it a magazine article? Is it a journal article? Is it a tweet from, you know, an academic? I mean, if it's a tweet from Paul Krugman, you know, and then it links then to his article in the New York Times, which, you know, I mean, what does it matter? Does it matter as much anymore? And it does seem like students are kind of impatient with that kind of, you know, hammering that, you know, into them. Because they have to apply critical thinking regardless of the format, right? Because it could be a crap tweet, or it could be, you know, a really authoritative tweet. It could be a crap blog or a great book, you know? So you still have to apply, so does it really matter? I mean, I'm channeling my younger colleague and trying to be, you know, think differently, you know? Did you guys talk about that?
Well, I don't think anybody was of the opinion that it didn't matter, you know, but we did, you know, when you get into things like blogs, it becomes real gray. I think it becomes very gray, you know, depending on, well, you know, who's writing this blog, you know, and because more and more college professors, because it's a medium, same with Facebook, you know, there's posts on Facebook by professors or professionals in the field because it's the medium that people are going to, and so you know, I don't know how you can just say, you know, no blogs, or, you know, no web pages. It's like, it's kind of like that, no .coms, you know, it's too, it does not really address, it's too simplistic. So I don't, yeah, that wasn't where our discussions went. I mean, there was nobody who was of the opinion that it didn't matter. It was more of, and I don't want to make it sound like that the creation process then is the the final. See, it's real gray. It's like saying, I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it. But it's like, there's certain characteristics of a book that a blog post doesn't have. You know, there's a certain immediacy generally to a blog post, or a tweet, even more so. I showed my students the tweets. Some guy in Pakistan was tweeting the Osama bin Laden raid, and he just had no idea what was, he was like, oh, fireworks or something, you know, he didn't know what was going on. But it had, you know, it's relevant because it was so immediate. But, you know, I still think the format probably matters. You know, you're going to get different information out of a book than, you know, a blog post. Yeah.
I'm trying to format what I'm really thinking here, format as process in my head. I mean, I guess, of course, the threshold concepts all have to be, we're looking at them separately, but they have to be layered and filtered, you know, just like the landscape that Judy and Tom were talking about. And that while you might have a tweet that could be wonderful in some way, and it could be crappy in other ways, you certainly would want a student to understand the format as process so that they could then determine whether it had any depth or breadth enough to be meaningful to their project or whatever it is they're working on. So that's where format as process is essential. They have to know that. So I mean, it's all a part of a puzzle.
They all overlap. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not separate. And I'll speak to a little bit about how when our instruction unit went out to create the class, where some of the difficulties started. But I think what you're talking about also crosses into authority.
Oh, sure.
Because it's contextual. You know, a tweet, it's a crap tweet here, but it's a great tweet here, you know.
And of course, you know, we're looking at a room full of information professionals, and even if you gave us a tweet that, you know, one person would think it was fabulous because they have the context and the knowledge behind it, and I might think that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, right? So even with people who are in the know about how to decipher this stuff, it's still a morass, right? But for students, isn't that our goal, is to try to give them those tools? And it's really, let's face it, we know it's a challenge from the utmost degree, but that's why I think, I like the threshold concepts because they are kind of a larger, overarching ideas behind the skills that we're doing. Because I have to tell you, I just want to give you credit right now for being one of the first people I know to get up publicly and say, is it new wine in old bottles? Because I hear it everywhere in the hallways where I go. Nobody's really stood up and said it, so I want to give you credit for that. And also, for stepping back with your metacognition skills and be able to say that the strengths is that they're universal, because I think that's probably something I knew too, but that I hadn't really thought about them in that terminology, and I love like universal design and for instruction is fabulous, and I think that is a really good way to explain it, that that it can go from the kindergartner to the senior citizen. So that maybe gives me more, it kind of gives me more belief in them. You know what I mean? Because I think that they're fabulous. I said to Melissa when we were driving up here, you know what I think this would be really great? In your first library science course, you know, when you're in library school, there's so many people who go to library school and kind of know it because they've either been working in libraries or
And you love libraries, yeah.
There's a lot of us come to it from another career or discipline, and it takes that little hurdle before you go, oh, now all of a sudden I get it, right? And I can see if they had taught this kind of threshold concept idea early on in an MLIS degree or an MLS, you know, it would be brilliant. So I think, well, if it has validity there, it has to be extrapolated to have validity everywhere, because that's what we're trying to get at. So thanks for sharing those things, because they kind of help me think about it a little bit.
Thank you.
I also, to add to that, I think that it can, these days, it can actually get even more, well, first I want to back up and say the old wine in new bottles. I'm thinking that we get up in front of these students and we talk about different tools and skills and things, and I think it does very much seem so abstract to some
Mhm.
students. And I think if we're backing up and making it more simplified and more basic, that's the whole idea of gravity, you know? If we're backing up and making it more basic, I think it might be able to enrich discussions and open them up and make them more palatable and participatory by students. That is just one thought. But the other one is that I think that our, as formatted process, I think it's getting even more complicated because you're thinking about people who self-publish.
Yeah.
Online journals, even though they may be online peer-reviewed journals, they're going directly to the web. So I think that it's going to be challenging us to think, as we're trying to make these discrete, you know, this is the information you're going to find in a book, and thinking about the information cycle, what, not only what is created, but when it's created. Some of that is further complicated by the online environment because of the abilities. You know, we're pushing open educational resources now. Some of these things that you can access, they go directly to the web, and it's challenging those traditional formats that we're standing up there teaching. So I think it can create even richer discussions, but I think it can also be even more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You had your hand up in the back there?
I'm just shifting the whole idea of format as process. I'm just thinking like, you know, you're doing a 1-credit course. I don't know, how many of us teach one-shots in here? Raise your hand if you teach one-shots mostly. Raise your hand if you teach like embedded or personal librarian. And then raise your hand if you're doing, actually have a 1-credit to 3-credit course. So there's a mix. I wonder if there's a best way to do it or if it can in some way be incorporated into all those formats. Obviously one-shot being the hardest, and what, you know, we fight for is just more time, faculty to give us more time with students. And where I teach, when I teach a one-shot, one thing that I do think that our director supports that I think is good, works in our favor, is that we only teach when there's an assignment at hand, a research assignment at hand. And what brings relevance to what we're doing is the students need us to help them do their research, and those hands-on skills, you know, work well for that type of thing. But I know some people that teach one-shots and they're still doing the library orientation, you know, filling the grocery cart, you know, full of this big, broad library orientation, which students don't remember. And I tend to think, you know, I'm wondering where this is going to go, because now I hear more 1-credit to 3-credit courses, which then takes it outside of integrating it into regular course content, which is actually where I thought information literacy should be going, but where it's difficult to have to get faculty to embrace that. So just kind of asking for other people's comments on where they think it's going and how that can be done.
Well, I think there may be a way to do it by flipping or by creating modules that contain the concepts you want people to understand. You have to work with the instructor in order to make sure that the audience is responsible for looking at those pieces. But I think it can be done with an embedded librarian model where these are the things the instructor wants you to understand about information in the context of the sciences in this class or this assignment. So you're still customizing it to the need, but you can pull those threshold concepts in because they're not going to understand how to read a data set unless they understand how it's created, you know? So the format becomes important because they have to understand how it's constructed, how to deconstruct it themselves.
I have a question about assessment. Is this a graded class?
It is, yeah, it's a graded.
How do you have assessment and any data attached to it? Because that's what a lot of us.
You mean assessment of the class?
Whether the student outcomes.
You know, we don't. And that's one of the things that kind of irks me is that this class has existed for 35 years. And really the only assessment we have is there's a student survey given on the last day of class. which is really more, we know it's an assessment of what they thought about the class. And I would love to see some kind of a cohort study where they're followed. They take the course, and then they're followed for the next 4 years to see how they do, how it helps them. And I know it would have to be, objective, because they wouldn't have like there wouldn't be a cohort that doesn't take it, because everybody takes it. But I've been there for 2 years, and it's a tenure track job, and I was all like chomping at the bit to do this, and I was really discouraged not to because it's so nebulous to really
A lot of us do that.
assess it. Yeah, I think it would be great because there's people on our campus, other faculty, even honestly, some of the library faculty don't really agree with teaching this course. And there are some, vocal non-library faculty members who think that it should be, tossed because they don't think it works. They don't think it teaches students anything.
We can't prove that it does.
Yeah, I know, but yes.
I just want to go back to what you said in the beginning, because I think it kind of addressed what was said by the librarian in the back of the room. You said it was a process where you sat down and talked about what matters. So what I'm taking away from what you said and what I learned today would not be to go try to create this process with what you gave and the steps that you gave, but to sit down with the librarians that I work with and say what matters to us in our community and what we think the students need to learn.
Absolutely.
And the importance even of assessment, because in the classes that I've done, we have done assessment. I put in a question about the Library of Congress. No one knew what it was. People like Dewey, Huey, they were all over the place and no one knew this. So to me, it was really important every class to mention and to talk about and say, okay, it's important for you to know this, because when you do go on the shelf and look for a book, the items that are next to that item, it's also going to be about that topic. And they were all like amazed by it because no one knew what it was, but that was a local process.
Yeah.
It may not be the same somewhere else, and even talking about format, it may not matter, and I think that's something that we should all, no matter what you're doing, we should all make it matter, because it's becoming even more and more important as information changes and the dynamics of what's true or not.
Yeah.
It's changing so much, so it's important that we let them know, yes, format, it is important.
Yeah, so again, I would recommend this threshold concepts in information literacy, the Townsend article, because it really it was a nice base that we could kind of jump off from. But again, I think that the threshold concepts are universal enough that their application can be different. How you apply them in say a public library might be different than you would in an elementary school library, as you would an undergraduate library, and certainly, if you're up higher, in the law library. But I think that the concepts are really kind of universal. The application is different. So, yes.
Going back to format as process, which I know a lot of us have been grappling with, I had a few concrete examples of this mattering which came into my mind, and one was a really fantastic assignment I had in library school where we had to, it was an art history library class, and so we had to choose one artist, and we had to look at multiple different encyclopedias and read the entries and then compare them. And so even, within these, so-called authorities, there were vast differences in, the length of the articles, how in-depth the information was, and I think most importantly, some of them, really contained some bias, against the artist, depending on like when the time it was written. So, I love this, idea of like opening the floodgates and, the digital revolution and, like parallels to the printing press and all of this, this great stuff, but I think at the same time, like we're charging off so fast sometimes that we're forgetting, that, even on a really micro scale, like paying attention to like, who is the person who's writing this, compared with other people in their field, and that's the reason, like peer review has been so important, like having other peers, experts in your field look over your work before it goes to publication. So I think we really can't, throw out format as process and, teaching, our students.
But that really argues more for the authority piece of it.
They're very
Which
linked.
is
I
so-
mean, they are very,
That's incredible.
everything is linked.
Because those were
There's-
all encyclopedias, so the format wasn't different, but it's the critical thinking about each
Mhm.
of those sources.
But it can
When was it written, who wrote it,
Yes.
you know, what was their context? So the authority part is more important than ever, you know, before.
I think it's the most important.
But, yeah, so that part.
But it goes
No
back to,
question.
you know, format too, again, with like, if you had a professor, you know, who wrote a scholarly peer-reviewed article, and then you're also looking at his tweets, you know, his tweets are gonna be more immediate, they're gonna be the ideas that are, you know, just coming to him right now, and haven't gone through any, like, you know, necessarily formal
Sure.
process. So, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, we're struggling with these concepts, and it's gonna be, you know, very challenging to get this across to students.
I think this is hard. I mean, I really do think, you know, somebody mentioned it, and it made me think of it, and it was the last point I wanted to raise was that once our instructional unit got their hands on this and they set out to design these modules, this, you know, this alleged plug-and-play kind of class design, it didn't really go very well because they couldn't, they found it almost impossible to find, you know, something that was just one threshold concept. And it broke into more of, you know, talking about Google, and now here's all the threshold concepts that we're talking about. In fact, I'm thinking about this class, and I wonder about, because I have to design it now, I have to put it together, you know, and I know I have a lot of like templates to use, but I still have to kind of like put something together. And I'm wondering, are the threshold concepts really even something for the student, or are they more for me to keep like a mental framework of where I'm going with it? And one of our librarians suggested what he's going to do is on day one, he's going to read the five commandments. Here's the 5 things we're going to do this semester. We're going to talk about format as process, and you know, authority, contextual, and you know, authority, and but then not mention them directly again. Then it's just going to be more teaching about them without really mentioning it, because I think you can get into this. Like the pendulum can swing too far to any one direction, and that if you're just talking threshold concepts and you are talking conceptual things where you're not going to necessarily, you know, students need then the skills to apply these concepts, you know. And if you go the other way, then you're just, it seems like it would be easy to get back to that place where it's like, use this, don't use this, you know. And I don't think that you know, like you're saying, a professor tweeting, well, you know, if they just wrote a paper and now they're tweeting about it, how can that not be valid information on the subject of the paper, you know?
We've already gone over time, so.
Oh, okay.
But thank you.